Hello and welcome. As you see on the slide, this is a presentation based on the research behind the book, Second Century Believers. So I am going to focus on the procedures of research that I used which is at the heart of this book. I've written all kinds of things, from fiction to analysis to history, and in 2022, I read about a Bahá'í Publishing Trust webinar, or a publishing webinar, which included the U.S. Publishing Trust and George Ronald, and I attended that to see what I could find out. And toward the end of it, people were wondering about whether they could get their poetry published. The editor-in-chief of George Ronald at the time, May Hoffman, said essentially that what the faith needs is history. 300 years from now, they're going to want to know what we were thinking in these early years. So I started out by reading about what was going on in second century Christianity and thought maybe I could find some parallels. I ended up wondering these became my research questions, and they were also questions that I asked to respondents. What attracts people to the Baha'i faith? Why do they join it? And why do they stay in it? The question I asked is, why have you remained active? And I thought this would be important information for the Baha'i community and also for seekers. I grew up Christian and was very much into the Christian faith, especially the Bible. And as I wondered what the earliest Christians were thinking back then, and what Baha'is would have been thinking during our second century, which began in 1944. The Guardian would soon launch his worldwide 10-year crusade, 1953 to 63, which outlived him as he passed away in 1957. One of the hands of the cause, Mason Reamy, broke the covenant, declaring he was the next guardian, which flopped. The hands decided to establish the first universal house of justice, who presumably would be able to determine the fate of the guardianship. Although we have many personal accounts about reactions among the Baha'is at that time, I don't know of a cohesive study about it. What interests me at this time is what has kept people active in the faith for the past half century. This slide presents the heart of this presentation. So as I said, it's basically a qualitative research study. If you're not familiar with qualitative research, it looks into feelings and experiences and draws on individuals' perceptions, rather than asking them to rate their agreement-disagreement with statements on a questionnaire. Ideas, concepts, not interested in that. So as we go through the slides, I'll be speaking about the process. So please pause the presentation and read the quotes. And take note of the titles on the slides, which show my various steps in my work to find similarities in the thinking among the respondents. So this generation has similar reference points. The Soviet threat of nuclear war, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy establishing the Peace Corps, and then his assassination. Young men drafted into the Vietnam War, school desegregation, and demonstrating for racial justice. The Woodstock Festival of celebration, basically. There were many comments about the respondents' reactions to those events. I need to say that, yes, people did express interest. Baha'is, before they were Baha'i, expressed interest in the Peace Corps. So as I said, the slides contain selected quotes from the many interviews. The titles indicate my assessment of the meaning in the responses as I started to group them. So please hit pause to read the quotes on the slides. Growing awareness was a label I settled on during an early assortment of respondents' reactions to 60s events. The quotes about social issues show the individual respondents' reactions, which were rather similar. The titles on these early slides were early interpretations of the feelings being shared, and I'm only showing one or two examples per category. There were many, many more before I started interpreting and consolidating the shared meanings, the sentences, grouping them together, taking them out of the interviews and grouping them together in a new document. This person's reaction shows a responsiveness and sensitivity to the suffering of others as well as the injustices. And I called it growing awareness. She's coming into a new sort of awareness of what's going on. The 1960s decade was like a burst of energy, positive and negative. Religious scholars rank what they call the long 60s among the top 3 religious revivals, decades of religious revival in history. The long 60s means it includes some of the early 1970s. As I mentioned, the first House of Justice was elected in 1963, as many of you know, and they issued their first 9-year plan. So to do a qualitative analysis, the researcher focuses on groups of people who share common experiences. The parameters I used for respondents in this study were that they were in their teens or early 20s during the 9-year plan, 1963 to 74. Most of them declared in the late 60s, early 70s. Other parameters are they were not from Baha'i families. A few slides back, I mentioned some of the big issues in the 60s and 70s, and also the 2 major events in the faith, the election of the House and the release of the 9-year plan, were big positive issues for the Baha'is. So it's fair to think that these spiritually sourced events contributed to the charged spiritual atmosphere in the U.S. during that decade and contributed to the idea that it's one of the top 3 revivals in religious history. We all knew boys who were being drafted in the 60s, and we generally feared for them. We were in high school with them. We were in college with them. Several respondents who became Baha'i later burned their draft cards, which was punishable. One of them had grown up in a family of Quakers. As you know, it's a peaceful religion with a stance against violence of any kind. If he hadn't burned the card and just objected and moved to Canada like so many, he wouldn't have been punished, or at least not so harshly. 3 years. He had to do something, he didn't go to jail, but he had some alternative. I should say there were a couple of them. The so-called baby boom generation were the children of parents who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II, and many of them maintained the notion that it was honorable to respond to the nation's call for soldiers. So families were waging their own battles. For example, I had huge arguments with my father, who had been lieutenant colonel in the Army. Many boys from the U.S. fled to Canada to avoid being sent to a far-off war. And because this conference is being held in Calgary, I give a shout out to the Canadians for protecting those guys who listen to their hearts. Church-going was pretty common, apparently more so back then than now. And many of the respondents who became Baha'i had struggles with their families after they declared. Even after I'd been a Baha'i for decades, my father one day warned me to watch out for the Taliban. He actually thought I was a Muslim all those decades. Most of the Christian respondents complained that their clergy seemed to favor the Vietnam War and saw this as hypocrisy in the clergy. Others were from atheistic, agnostic families and had actually rejected religion, which should indicate to us that someone avowing to be atheist or agnostic may simply be rejecting some of the wrong-headed teachings in the churches. Other examples of questioning the logic or lack thereof of their clergy were these, in questioning inherited beliefs and so on. Like this respondent, others also described examples where they assessed their experience and understandings of religion using a logical lens. This generation was the largest population in the U.S. until the millennials. Last year, they beat our record, 2024. And in adolescence, the boomer population were much less restrained than the previous one. Also, there were things that families did together, interestingly enough, like watching news. There were often families preferred one of the 3 TV networks and would watch news together after dinner. As kids, we were exposed to the possibility of nuclear annihilation in grade school and did those duck and cover drills to prepare ourselves, which, as if it would save us. Families had bomb shelters in their backyards. We also knew of the violence against Black people and the children who were the first in their communities to desegregate schools. Young people were challenging authorities in multiple ways, which gave rise to what social scientists call a generation gap, because the youth were so different from their elders. The slides in this section show that several respondents had the gumption to question the logic of their clergy. And they were pretty young, so it's very interesting. They were even younger than teenagers in some cases, as they're arguing with their Sunday school teachers or their ministers. And some of these pre-Bahá'ís had already come to logical conclusions about God and reality. One of the ones mentioned the most was progressive revelation, which just struck them, and it struck me too, as just almost obvious and so logical. That, of course, there's a succession of teachers. These aren't just random events. Children ask questions if they're allowed to, and hopefully their parents, teachers, or other responsive adult take them seriously. Several respondents like this one had begun seeking from a young age, 9 or 10 years old, and there was another respondent who was 7 when she was arguing with her Sunday school teacher, got kicked out of the class. So you've been seeing the titles on the many slides so far, which now I'm going to. I got to the place where I've sorted into just 4 categories. Truth. So as I said, this is a qualitative research study which looks into feelings and experiences and draws on individuals' perceptions rather than asking them to rate their agreement or disagreement with statements on a questionnaire. So truth, well, I'll just say this. I'm going to read, first of all, I'm going to read, every single point just explain the true relationship between God and humanity. I'm just saying that because I see truth in there. So you can see that this is somebody who has understood or found truth in his seeking, or expressed it in his statement, his or her statement. The spiritual revival I mentioned earlier also included changes and reforms in the churches, as well as an influx of Eastern religious teachings, Hare Krishna, transcendental meditation inspired by Buddhism. Baha'i was still a largely unknown exotic name and sparked opposition in some families when their children expressed interest in it. But seekers did find cohorts at school who, like this one, and I might just read this one. It occurred to me that to solve the world's problems, everyone should have the same religion. Okay, there's some logic. This is about truth. Making that statement to about the only person in the enormous cafeteria at the time, I got this reaction. Are you a Baha'i? At first I rejected it outright. When I realized the implications were that Baha'u'llah was the return of the Spirit of Christ, I went ballistic. So probably that was a Baha'i that she ran into. And notice again, intuiting religious unity in this section, all the titles had quotes in them that I recognized as their understanding of truth, or their realization of truth in the responses, in their experiences. Looking for something more. Some were looking for a religion that made logical sense to them. They also showed some skepticism of the way religious teachings were taught, and this is a theme throughout the book. And when you read these quotes, you'll find probably things that you align with or that you resonate with. The idea of progressive revelation is simple and logical. When I learned about it, after entering the faith, I suddenly could make sense of history, which had always been presented as a series of wars and conquests with no overarching logical framework at all. Just random. Everything seemed random. And I've met other people who became Baha'i who expressed the same idea. An awakening. For many, perhaps, but finding the faith was a dramatic discovery. And I interpret this quote to indicate spiritual awareness. Even her mother joined the faith after seeing her turnaround. So this person was very astute at 7 years old to recognize that the Magi who followed the star to the baby Jesus in the manger was another religion. Others also didn't like the idea that only Christians would go to heaven and those in other religions were doomed to hell. So what they found in the Baha'i faith seemed true against some of these other assumptions from the churches. So truth was the first one. Community is another of the 4 final categories. Of course, experiencing the community, the Baha'i community, can take many turns, and we all need to make sure newcomers are warmly embraced. We used to learn when I was a new Baha'i that you should try to deepen the seeker before you introduce them to the community, because I think we know the diversity in the community can be a little daunting to people who aren't accustomed to that kind of, well, you could say the diversity in the room and what's going on. It sometimes seems chaotic, I guess, because we don't have one leader telling us all what to do. Some young people who sense there must be answers to their questions naturally sought like-minded others. So when they met people who shared similar ideas, sometimes they met Baha'is who introduced them to the faith. This is specifically about Woodstock, which seemed like a huge peace demonstration because it was in opposition to that war and war in general. So that connects back with some, I mentioned Woodstock as one of the themes that I mentioned that I saw. Also, there was much talk about the generation gap, and I mentioned that earlier too. The strong difference in outlooks and opinions between teens and their elders. So to see old and young people together was unusual. And we need to make sure this continues throughout the Baha'i community, that we don't segregate off young people, and that older people aren't afraid to approach teenagers or younger people in the faith. And of course, communities need to make sure that Baha'is in their community feel loved and appreciated. So even in some of the respondents' quotes, they talk about the nurturance they felt. Service. Of course, that's a big deal in our community. We all are enjoined to be of service of some kind, not just being elected to assemblies and appointed. Well, I hope that this is working, because I stopped it for a while. Okay, moving on. Speaking of working, service. Baha'is do not stop working, we keep working. There's plenty we can do. And plus, I included in here, I never did live a material life. So I wanted to serve. I ultimately included steadfastness and sacrifice under service category because they all involve collective action. Being steadfast generally here is sticking with it, doing your Baha'i thing, leading the Baha'i life, following the teachings. And sacrifice, the folks I interviewed are now mostly in their 60s and 70s and have remained actively engaged with the faith for more than half a century, which involves a certain amount of sacrifice in itself. And then dedication, love of the teachings, of the way the faith is self-governed. The other believers all contribute to their commitment to it, being dedicated and doing the work. And very much the life's purpose. Keep in mind that some of the respondents were atheists or agnostics when they joined the faith. Also notice that no one at all has mentioned Bible prophecies as one of the things that attracted them. And yet, on social media, there's so much focus on Bible prophecies, or prophecies in general. They're just not convincing enough, I guess, in this generation. Okay, the next category coming up is spirit. So we have truth, community, and now spirit. Service and now spirit, sorry. I'm going to read these quotes because they're from Abdu'l-Baha. By the power of the Holy Spirit working through his soul, man is able to perceive the divine reality of things. Paris talks. How do we judge whether they're satanic or from God? By the breaths and promptings of the Holy Spirit, which is light and knowledge itself. Through it, the human mind is quickened and fortified into true conclusions and perfect knowledge. This is conclusive argument showing that all available human criteria are erroneous and defective, but the divine standard of knowledge is infallible. And that is from Promulgation of Universal Peace. Of course, it involves meditation. Remaining active in the faith, remaining in the faith itself, is probably only possible when Baha'is focus on prayer, meditation, studying the writings, and putting it all into practice. And of course, there are Baha'is that I encounter who pray, meditate, and remain Baha'i, but they aren't involved in the community. So maybe there are some clues in this presentation or in this research that would help us figure out why people aren't engaging with the rest of the community. Some of them are probably clear. Others, I don't know, may need to be scoped out. And I'll read this, attracted by spirit, from one of the respondents. The Holy Spirit was so tangible that people walked off the street to ask what was going on there. There were 20 plus people of all ages and types and colors, hippies, students, working people aged 18 to 40, which for me was unusual enough. But the feeling in that room was powerfully uplifting, like nothing I had experienced before. And there were several reactions like this. And then answering of a prayer. These longtime Baha'is point to the Holy Spirit as one of the most important Baha'i teachings. And this respondent said, being connected to the Holy Spirit is the greatest lesson any of us can learn and internalize. Interestingly, now there's all of these quotes about spirit coming from the respondents, and yet we don't really hear about it much in any of the, I don't know, in letters or in conversations or in social media, etc. We need to figure that out, or maybe campaign for more discussion about spirit. It's interesting that some people say they feel the spirit while others don't know what that means. We're told to pray and meditate, ponder, think about on Baha'u'llah's words, focus on the words, clear your mind and focus on the words. So, feeling the spirit. Signing the declaration card never meant anything. Becoming sensitive to the Holy Spirit means everything. So the four themes, truth, community, service, and spirit, can be seen as a continuum in the respondents' thinking. They begin as seekers of truth about reality. They come to see the power of community of believers whose thoughts, feelings, and beliefs align with theirs. They understand that a basic purpose of community is to be of service to humanity. Spirit is mentioned a lot. The respondents avow belief in the power of spirit that attracts their hearts, illuminates their thought, raises their level of consciousness. So, truth, community, service, and spirit, they show a continuum. They begin as seekers of truth about reality. They come to see the power of community of believers, as I said, whose thoughts, feelings, and beliefs align with theirs. They understand the basic purpose of community is to be of service to humanity. And they avow a belief in the power of the Spirit, which attracts their hearts, illuminates, I think it says souls under there, and raises their level of consciousness. So, that's the end of my presentation, and I hope, excuse me, I wish we could interact. So, I'd love to hear your questions and comments, and if you have any, you can find me on LinkedIn. Thank you, and see you somewhere, someday. Bye.